talking about Zen meditation. And so I guess actually, how many people here have ever done meditation? By meditation I mean like sat down for a period of at least 3 or 5 minutes or longer, and specifically tried to control what was going on inside your head in one form or another. Okay, so most people here are at least familiar with that. Okay, so that's good. Has anybody done Zen meditation, specifically Zazen? A couple people. Okay. So there's lots of different kinds of meditation, and generally I tried to phrase that as generically as possible, and I think that is sort of the umbrella, is trying to control what's going on inside your head. But there are a lot of specific mechanisms, and different practices and traditions sort of have different ways of approaching it. So what I have the most experience with and can kind of talk through for people who maybe don't have that much experience with meditation is I'll give the basics of Zen meditation. So there are a few different styles, but generally all of them are about quieting. So there are other kinds of meditation that are like, there's something called a body scan, where you kind of go through and individually focus your attention on each part of your body. And there's chakra meditations and all kinds of other stuff. Zen is pretty simple. The idea is really just to get your brain very focused on one thing. And the typical starting point, at least from the few sources that I've read, is something called counting your breaths, where basically you sit and, I don't know, so in a little bit maybe we'll do a little bit of sitting just so people can kind of try and get a feel for it. So, I mean, if you can sit full lotus position, which is basically one foot up here and then the other one up on the other leg, which I can't do, then that's great. Otherwise, you can sit half lotus like this, which I also can't do for more than about 10 seconds. Ow. Or you can sit cross-legged like this, or if you still can't do that, which I couldn't 8 months ago when I started, you can sit in a chair, and that's fine. The posture is actually like not that important of a part of it, and there are tons of, especially American meditation centers, where people meditate in chairs, just because Americans tend to not be nearly as flexible because we sit in chairs our whole life. The point of your position is you want to try and get into something that is stable and relatively comfortable, because you want to be able to sort of not be distracted by your body. So you want to not be distracted by your body, but you also want to be sharp. You want a sharp pointed focus, not like, so lying down is bad, because if you're lying down you'll tend to drift and you'll kind of fall asleep. So the idea is stable, not in pain, but also focused. Your attention is there, and a big part of it is immediacy. So really trying to get your brain to be exactly in the moment, not 10 seconds ago, not a minute from now, not tomorrow, not 5 years from now, but right now. So all of the practices I think are generally pretty focused on that as the objective. So to go through the basics of counting your breath, effectively you want to count from 1 to 10 with one number on each breath in and each breath out. So it's hard to sort of demo this because I have to breathe and say the numbers, but you get into a stable position. The standard place for your hands is just kind of in your lap like this, and just and so that was 4. And the idea is that you want your brain's focus to be 100% on those numbers. As you say a number, every part of your concentration should be on that. And then once you get to 10, you loop back to 1. Now, a question that you will hit almost immediately, if you've never done this before, is what do I do if I suddenly realize that I'm at 37? Or that I'm thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow morning, or whatever. When you realize that you've gotten distracted and are no longer counting. And the answer is that you basically just start back at 1. And most importantly, you don't start back at 1 and say, damn it, I suck at this, I'm failing. In the same way that someone who's learning to juggle, when they, if I'm just starting or trying to learn a new trick and I try and do it and they fall, I don't say, damn it, I suck at this, I should give up, I should quit, this isn't helping. Because what's happening is that you are training your brain to learn to focus and to control its focus of attention. So actually, every time that you start back at 1, you should be glad, because you have just trained your brain a little bit more to refocus itself. That said, you should still try and maintain your focus and get to 10. Does anybody have any questions on that?
What's the difference between meditation and autogenic training?
Meditation and what?
Autogenic training.
I don't know anything about autogenic training. Does anybody else?
Could you repeat the question, please? Or could you be louder? What's the difference between meditation and autogenic training?
Can you describe what autogenic?
I've never heard the term autogenic training, so.
I guess it's something similar. It's a form of self-hypnosis where you try to really focus on particular parts of your body, try to relax those parts of your body, and try not to let your mind wander. And then there's certain techniques where you can actually heat up, for example, your arms, or try to increase the felt weight of your limbs.
Sounds related. Yeah, I mean, it might fit under the umbrella definition that I used of focus, trying to control what's going on inside your head. I don't know if that's a formal definition or not, but it's how I think of it. Any other questions? I mean, do people want to maybe try this for a few minutes, just to kind of get a feel for it? Sound good? And then we can, if people have questions after that, because you might sort of get more of a sense of what it's like. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, does anybody else who does Zen have any other sort of beginner tips or suggestions?
One thing that I've heard is important in my practice is breathing from the abdomen, not the lungs, or not the chest. Do you want to elaborate on that? Or?
Yeah. So definitely one of the things that's talked about, I think it's the hara is the term for it.
I don't remember.
I think hara is the Japanese word for it, but basically it's like a sort of center that's like right behind your belly button, and you're supposed to sort of envision breathing, like filling that space when you breathe and then expelling from that space.
Lower your diaphragm, focus on your diaphragm.
Yeah. So, and posture-wise, especially if you're sitting in a chair is okay if you can't, if your knees don't do lotus, but you still shouldn't be leaning back in the chair because that won't get that sharp focus of attention. So you really want to try and be straight backed and, kind of, so the traditional Zazen pose is not only full lotus, but your spine is supposed to be rigid. They tell you to visualize basically having an iron rod straight up running from the ground through your spine, through the top of your head, and it should just be a straight line. So that's, really, and the other thing is not hunched shoulders, but open shoulders. So it's your hands are almost kind of facing out. But the posture stuff takes time, and I'm still really bad at it, so I'm not going to claim that it's essential. All right, so let's do a few minutes, and then whenever I get bored, so we'll keep talking. Yeah, grab some pillows or something if you want to try it on the ground. Traditionally in Zen, you sit on 2 cushions, like the way that I'm sitting. So you have Zafu and Zabuton, right? Is that right, Kana? Which one's which? The Zabuton is the small one, and then this is the Zafu? Backwards? I don't know. Anyway.
Zafu's the small one.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, alright, let's do it. All right, that's enough for a taste. So, any questions now having tried it? Is that difficult?
Karaoke didn't help.
It's definitely harder to do meditation, especially when you're first starting with it, when there's distractions. Like, the ideal place for if you're a beginner is in an enclosed room where you're the only person and there's, basically minimal outside sound or light or anything. But as you get more into it, it can actually be kind of a good challenge to practice in increasingly distracted areas. And actually, there are progressions of more and more difficult things, just like sort of in anything. As you get better at it, you can do more difficult stuff. So once you get pretty good at the counting your breaths, then you can basically go to following your breath, where it's basically exactly the same thing, only instead of saying the numbers in your head, you just concentrate entirely focused on each individual breath. And then there is another level which is really hard. I only even try it once in a while just for kicks, but it's called Shikan Taza, which is literally translates as just sitting, where you just sit. You focus your intention entirely 100% on the current moment in its entirety. And it's really difficult to do. I don't know, have you done much Shikan Taza?
No, I've after counting breaths, the progression that I have been following is saying moo.
Okay, yeah, that's another one. Yeah, so there are a variety of different ones. Are you doing the koan or just saying it?
Just saying it.
Okay. So, yeah, saying moo, which is basically the Japanese word for kind of or nothingness, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know the.
It's along those lines.
Something like that, I believe.
Non-existence, no thing. It's kind of a very hard word to translate.
Yeah.
And yeah, so then the last thing that is kind of another part of Zen that depending on who you talk to is more or less a central part. There are actually a couple different sects within Zen, and they emphasize different things. So koans, who's heard of a koan? Koans are like these sort of classic, when Americans think of Zen and you think of like the Zen master says this one sentence that you don't have any idea what the fuck it means, and then asks the student what it means, and the student doesn't know, and you're supposed to like figure it out. That's a koan. So like, what's the sound of one hand clapping is a classic koan. Or another classic one is, does a dog have Buddha essence? Or actually, the koan in that one, the mu koan is a Zen student, and it's a specific historical one, but I don't remember which one. But a Zen student asks his master, "Does a dog have the Buddha essence?" And was it Joshu?
Master was Joshu.
Joshu, yeah. And Joshu says, "Mu." No thing, no answer. Your question is invalid, effectively. So in a koan, what you do is you concentrate on the question, and you try and arrive at the answer without reasoning the answer. And this is a very sort of counterintuitive concept to a Western mind that is built on sort of rationalizing and constructing arguments and scientific understanding. And the thing that you have to understand if and when you ever try koan practice is that you are not trying to find a rational answer by logic or reason. You're specifically not trying to. The design of a koan is really the same as all of the other things. It's specifically to try and shut down your rational mind because it's unanswerable by the rational mind. So when you're working on a koan, if you ever do, don't try and solve it. Just concentrate on the question. Desire the answer to the question without reasoning about the answer to the question. And if that sounds hard, it is. It's really hard. Okay, so that's some sort of basics of Zen practice. And I guess the other thing that I would maybe add on to that is that as you get better at these things, one of those kind of like idioms in Zen is everything is practice, which is the idea that basically, while you're sitting on a cushion and, counting, that's practice. But while you're walking down the street, that's also practice. You should also be trying to clear your mind, keep your attention focused on the immediate moment. When you're, in basically any context, you can always be doing this. It's just harder when you're more active. So for people who are beginning, you focus on it on this kind of set time when you're working on it. But the goal is to get to a point, and sort of the idea of enlightenment, or kensho is the Japanese word, or satori is, I think, I forget what language that's from. Is that Hindi?
Sanskrit, maybe?
Sanskrit,
no,
maybe?
Nirvana would be Sanskrit.
Anyway, these are all basically names for the same sort of concept in one form or another, just sort of from different traditions. And the idea is that you get into a point where your brain can basically always run in that clear, focused, immediate state. So we can talk a little bit more about kind of the Zen philosophy, but I wanted to go into some of the science first. So anything else about practice before we talk about neuroscience? Okay, cool. So that's the same sort of thing of who feels like they have at least sort of a basic understanding of neuroscience. Like, I'll give a specific sort of litmus test. Do you know roughly what a neuron looks like and how it operates? Most people? Okay, so the quick version, just to get everybody on the same page, is your brain has like billions and billions and billions of these little cells that are pretty simple. They just have one end that is basically a receiver, and one end that is a long tendril that shoots off a lot of little tendrils that are sort of senders that output signal. And at any given time, a neuron either activates or doesn't. And effectively, if the combination of the input signals into the receiving end of the neuron, which is, I think, the axon? No, the dendrite. The dendrite, yeah. If it reaches a certain threshold, then it activates, and it sends a pulse of electricity up the axon, which is the long part, and out, and sends that to all of the other ones. And this is occurring, what's the rate? It's like on the order of milliseconds for a neuron to fire, like 10 or 100 milliseconds, I think.
Sounds right.
So, very fast.
Myelinated sheath are not on the axon. It's actually variable on the speed.
Yeah. But on that order of 10 milliseconds, give or take, an order of magnitude. So fast, but actually much slower than computers that we have. But the combination of all of these things firing all the time determines everything about you, at least is sort of the prevailing view of neuroscience, that every thought you have, every action you take, every emotion you feel, every experience you feel that you perceive to have is just the combined effect of all of these neurons firing dozens of times a second. So from that, so that's one thing to understand, and then the other thing to understand is that there's not any central observer. There's not a central spot in the brain that's sort of like, this is where your consciousness is. It's more like everything is just sort of connected to everything else, and particular regions seem to have responsibilities for particular tasks. So we can isolate parts of the brain that when you're, doing heavy visual processing, like reading, there's parts of your brain that are very active. If you are experiencing, certain intense emotions like love or whatever, there are other parts of your brain that tend to be active. So you can sort of map out the relationships of the parts of the brain. And one of the other important things to understand, particularly in the context of meditation and whether or not it's actually beneficial to you, is the concept of neuroplasticity, which basically is that the way that you learn things, the way that you change, the reason that you are not exactly the same person in terms of your personality, your knowledge, etc., now as you were 5 years ago, is that your brain is constantly sort of iteratively mutating itself. So every experience you have causes your neurons to change their structure. They grow new connections over time and lose some connections over time. So effectively, when I train myself how to juggle by doing that throw, drop, catch, drop, what's happening is that there are neurons in my brain that are trying to basically figure out the right pattern, the right processing to follow to throw and catch those whatever I'm juggling. So in the context of Zen, the idea is that basically, as you are trying to focus your attention, you are training the neural pathways in how to focus your attention. Check my notes. So I'm going to get into some territory in neuroscience now where I'm considerably less familiar. So I will sort of this is especially a part where if people know in more detail than I do, I'd love to have more input. But there are a couple additional topics that I think are sort of useful to know about in the context of the intersection between Zen and neuroscience. One of them is the idea of left brain versus right brain. So are people generally familiar with that? So left brain tends to be sort of logical, analytical, strong conception of self-identity. Right brain tends to be more emotional, more big picture, and more sort of detached from self, more general. And I think that it's very poorly understood still. These are, I think, even in the neuroscience community, I get the impression that this is viewed as a very kind of wishy-washy differentiation. And it's sort of like, well, there seems to be a bunch of stuff here that does this and a bunch of stuff here that does this, so we can kind of describe it this way, but we don't really understand how or why in detail. So for me, I think of it more from kind of a higher level abstraction of basically your brain has some fundamentally very different kind of modes of operation built into it. There are parts of your brain that construct models of the world based on one very specific sort of way of identifying things, and other parts of your brain do it very differently. So you have this impression of your reality as being this very fixed and concrete thing, but in fact, different parts of your brain really have very different realities. And by increasing or decreasing kind of the prevalence or control or scope of some of those parts, it seems very plausible in the current sort of understanding of neuroscience that you could pretty significantly alter your fundamental reality. So there's at least, it fits into the current picture of neuroscience relatively well to suppose that these ideas of, monks meditating 10 hours a day for 30 years and suddenly becoming, or not suddenly, but over time, steadily becoming more grounded, more compassionate, more in control, more self-aware, that those could actually be things that, the brain changes. Different areas of the brain basically can be made stronger, made more expressive, made more fundamental to your general day-to-day, mode of acting, and result in those outwardly visible changes.
Jump in with a simple example.
Please.
So when doctors scan the brains of blind people with an fMRI, they find that they have similar physical structure in their brains as normal people. I mean, obviously being blind doesn't change the way your brain grew as you developed, but when they measure activation of the brain areas responsible for like touch or taste or senses other than sight, they find that those areas of the brain activate in larger regions than in people who are not blind. And correspondingly, the areas that would process sight have shrunk. So because they weren't being exercised regularly, the brain sort of converted those neurons into more processing power for the senses that the person did have.
So basically there's kind of a hypothesis right now in this field, this intersection of fields, if you will, that meditation over time actually sort of grows and strengthens the parts of your brain that are responsible for compassion and centeredness, and alleviates or sort of helps you gain control over the parts of your brain that are responsible for things like worrying and anger and jealousy and a lot of the kind of negative emotions that lead to stress and build up stress over time, which is a good segue into the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the kind of neuroscience of stress. And this gets back to kind of, even if you don't believe in enlightenment, there are some other good reasons. There's a pretty good case to be made that meditation may just be sort of a good day-to-day health activity. And that relates to stress and how the relationship between your brain and stress and illness. So I think I have a quote in here from this book that I was reading that I think kind of presents the case reasonably well. So maybe I'll just go from there. So yeah. This, by the way, as I have a few really good quotes from this book, which is, if you're interested in learning more about this, easily the best book that I've read. It's actually a transcript from a conference in 2005 that was hosted by the Dalai Lama. It's called the Mind and Life Institute, and they have basically annual conferences on sort of, it's like a gathering of spiritual leaders, particularly Buddhist, but also other, and scientific leaders. And so the one in 2005 was focused on meditation and its effects on health and its health benefits. And so this is just the transcript of all of it. And they have a bunch of talks from leading neuroscientists and also talks from spiritual leaders. Really interesting. So anyway, this one was about kind of stress and the relationship between meditation and stress. So I'll just go ahead and read it. All this is based on the logic that if you can get the energy to your muscles in 2 seconds instead of 3, you're more likely to survive. It also makes sense that you turn off all sorts of long-term building projects in your body. This is no time to work on renovating your liver. By the way, this is in the context of like the evolutionary response to stress, like, oh my god, there's a lion trying to eat me. So this is no time to work on renovating your liver. When you're running for your life and the lion is one step behind you, it's not a good time to ovulate. During stress, you stop digestion, growth, the repair of your body, you stop reproduction, and you stop your immune system. You can do those things later if you're still alive. And all of this is wonderful for a zebra running for its life because it's a way for its body to deal with fear and pain. But your body does the exact same thing for days and months and years because of psychological suffering, which psychological suffering is sort of, in the Buddhist parlance, is sort of the general umbrella term for all of those senses of frustration and anger and jealousy and all of those things that meditation seems to sort of help control. So the case, there's a reasonably strong case that, well, there's a very, very strong concrete scientific case that high levels of stress as manifested in certain physiological things that happen in your body, chemicals basically that, are emitted during stressful situations, if they have sustained high levels in your body over long periods of time, it leads to all kinds of negative health effects. And there's reasonable evidence that I think is less conclusive, but pretty good in the scope of all of the research on meditation, much better than for things like enlightenment, that long-term meditation can actually help reduce those levels of those negative chemicals.
In particular, one you might have heard of is cortisol, which is generally elevated for long periods of time in stressful people. And it's a hormone whose effect on your body involves, as you said, inhibiting other growth signals and generally breaking down tissue to give you energy, which is great if you're running away, but over long periods of time can just lead to you wasting away, essentially.
So I think that is all of the stuff that I was going to say on neuroscience. So does anybody else have any other sort of comments on neuroscience as it relates to Zen?
One book that I really like that I'm still working through is called Zen and the Brain. And it's written by a medical doctor who's also practices Zen, and it goes into lots and lots of detail about the mechanisms and what we know about why this is happening or why this might be happening. So that's what I would recommend for more detail.
Yeah. There's some. So I read a book called Meditating Selflessly, and it went into a fair amount of detail about sort of the hypotheses, but it still was pretty inconclusive. Meditating Selflessly. Right now, my impression, and maybe the book you read had more detail, but in Meditating Selflessly, there's a lot of pretty detailed neuroscience, but most of it is at the level of like, here's this area that does this, and it's sort of plausible that it could work in this way, and that would explain sort of the effects that we seem to see with meditation, but we need more research, and so it's a lot of kind of setting out some hypotheses and providing sort of a framework of understanding what might be going on at the neural level, but I think there's still just a lot of research. I mean, basically, as soon as you start getting into things like emotions and, sense of self and those kinds of things, those are at the far, far end of understanding the brain. So it's a long ways to go.
Very good material in a book called The Genie in Your Genes. And it's questioning the whole thing of genetic determinism, and there's a whole section on neuroplasticity and all the latest Buddhist references.
Cool.
It's a very solid book.
What was it again?
The Genie in Your Genes. Just to say that you can change
Yeah.
your
Yeah. Okay, so we have.
This research. It's a group at UCLA, the Mindful Awareness Research Center. I forget the name of the PI. It's Daniel somebody. They have both academic conference proceedings and also pop neuroscience meditation books. That might be UCLA. About any study, any studies that quantify levels of certain neurotransmitters that are in the synapses that you get sometimes during meditative practice or during.
I don't have.
Are you asking if that exists, or?
Well, I'm sure studies that, if anyone's aware of studies that.
We actually have a really good recording of a talk given by a neuroscientist about Zen meditation, which I can put on later.
It was a TEDx talk, I think.
Yeah, I think it was a TEDx talk. But they did an experiment where they took Zen practitioners who'd been doing it for a while, I think like a couple years, and non-practitioners, and they subjected them to a standard pain tolerance test, which involves strapping a heated pad to your leg, and then they, crank up the heat until you say, no, this is too painful. And they did this while scanning these people's brains, both groups, and I think also during and outside of the person attempting to meditate while the test was happening. And as Geeber was saying, it's sort of at the level of, well, we know these areas of the brain sort of correspond to these emotions or this sort of processing happening. And what they found was that the Zen practitioners had increased levels of activity in the areas of the brain that dealt with sort of perceiving the present moment. So they were actually more fully aware of the what was going on in the experience. But the part of the brain that the sort of narrative voice, that's that sort of left hemisphere, I need to explain, I need to tell the story of what is happening right now, had much lower levels of activity than the non-practitioners. And they, Zen meditators had a higher pain tolerance than the non-practitioners. But it's a really cool talk. I'll put it on when it gets dark if people are interested.
I was actually thinking of what would be a nice study, if it hasn't been done, is basically a post-mortem analysis of brain chemistry. Non-practitioner and practitioner just happened to die suddenly. And distilled all the various chemicals that were in his brain at that moment in time. I mean,
they do have different physical structure.
Physical structure.
So you can do an autopsy of an old man who is
until we can scan in the connectome. That's going to be.
So
physical differences.
I think that the direction now and what there's a lot of stuff going on that we'll have to sort of wait to get the results from is basically longitudinal studies with sort of taking somebody who's just starting meditation and like doing a detailed scan of their brain every year for like 20 years as they get more practice and trying to map the change over time. But that takes a while.
We've only had functional MRI for a short amount of time relative to how long meditation takes to become a master. So you're right, they're just starting these longitudinal studies. So we're learning more, but we haven't got the time yet to actually answer it scientifically.
The same talk that I was telling you about, she also discussed people who had just started meditating and actually had the opposite of the long-term practitioners. So they, instead of being in the moment and sort of experiencing it but not letting it affect the course of their thought, the new practitioners would be attempting to sort of suppress the feelings from their body and would be talking to themselves internally, saying, no, I'm distancing myself from this, I'm not feeling it, and part of what the lecturer talked about is how to use this sort of new insight to improve the mechanism for teaching people how to meditate properly.
It actually has a lot to do with learning in general. So when you're learning something, when you're learning anything, like with juggling, if you focus on it, and this is true for anything you've already learned. So like if you focus on something that you already know how to do, like playing an instrument or doing some fine mechanical task with your hands, or fine motor skills, if you focus on it and you try and like consciously elaborate it, you will mess it up. You can't keep up with yourself. It has to be unconscious. So similar to what's happening with the beginners, is that they're focusing on it and it's making them worse at it because they have to focus on it to learn. And it's only once it's automatic that you get it swings back to the other side and you get the people who are the meditating, usually meditating.
So there's about 10 minutes left for this. So I hope that I've at least, presented the case that meditation may be sort of something that should be at least be thought of at the level of like eating right and getting exercise, of like this is something that may really just be healthy for you to do. I think that the evidence for that is definitely mounting, and it's something that I would encourage everybody to consider trying to incorporate into your life, even just sort of 10 minutes a day, 5 or 6 days a week if you can fit it in. For me, anecdotally, I have sort of, and it's interesting because it's tough to tell whether it's placebo or not. But in a sense, if the claim is that doing this makes you feel more grounded and centered and self-aware, and by placebo effect you do feel more grounded and centered and self-aware, well, okay. But anyway. I would recommend it if people want to do it. But in the last 10 minutes of the talk, I feel like I can't do a talk on Zen, especially Zen at Burning Man, and not indulge in a little bit of the philosophy of it and some of the maybe more kind of far out ideas about how deep the rabbit hole may be in the intersection of these topics. So that requires going a little bit into sort of the philosophy of Zen. Which I am not at all qualified to talk about, but I'll try and at least get across a couple of the core ideas. So one of the major ones, I think probably the major one, is non-duality. Would you agree non-duality is like one of the central things in Zen? So are people familiar with the concept of non-duality?
What about duality?
Or duality? Either? Okay, so duality is basically the notion that there is a me and there is a world outside of me, and there is a separation between those two. So I am here and you are out there and all of you are out there and all of Burning Man is out here, and those are two separate entities. And this is sort of something that is appears to be at least a very strong human intuition. I think most people feel that intuitively. I mean, would anyone disagree that that is what your sort of moment-to-moment experience feels like? So one of the kind of core concepts in Buddhism in general, and certainly in Zen, is non-duality, which is the rejection of that, basically, that's an illusion, that there isn't really any difference between you and the rest of the world. It's all just one thing, one expansive entity, and you are just sort of a part of that whole that your mind delineates, but that delineation only exists in your mind. And a huge part of the sort of focus of Zen practice is to try and erase that delineation, to try and free yourself from that illusion, to try and basically eliminate your ego or escape from your ego. And a lot of the sort of experience and discussion of, like, if you read accounts of people who have experienced Kensho, which is, the Zen term for enlightenment, it's this sense of loss of self. It's this sense of, and it's basically the same language that you hear in all major religious doctrines that talk about religious awakenings. It's this idea of oneness with everything, unity, wholeness, and, a sense of, no longer feeling that separation between you and the rest of the world. So in the context of neuroscience, this is kind of the far end of the spectrum of neuroplasticity. Is it actually possible through concentrated practice to shift your brain so much that you reroute your software, you basically reprogram your software to, instead of thinking about this entity that extends through, where my neurons are connected and I have this, skin and I breathe and I see things and I hear things, instead of focusing on that as, the model that I base everything else on, there's just the universe, and, that's it, basically. Can you cause your brain to shift that perspective? And that's a very interesting and open question, I think.
One thing that I found very helpful in my practices is that a lot of descriptions of enlightenment emphasize that it's, for most practical descriptions of it, is that it's not like turning a ratchet where you'll click over and you will be enlightened permanently.
Yeah.
That it's something that you reach, and obviously as you are practiced, you can reach it more easily. But it's not like, clicking a ratchet and your brain will permanently switch over to something else. That it's a lot of descriptions of it that I've read is that it's it's something that you can reach in a moment. And lose in a moment. Yeah,
and related to that is it's very strongly emphasized so Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is one of the classic, one of the first real English works on Zen, and there's a lot of emphasis on basically not trying to meditate so that you can be enlightened, because that is already in and of itself an ego-based idea. So you can never defeat the ego by letting the ego still dictate things. The idea is you want to get away from desires and objectives and focus on living in the moment. So if you're sitting there meditating, you're thinking, I need to get enlightened, I really need to be enlightened because I'm so miserable that I need to be enlightened so I can feel better. You are never going to get it, because you're entirely giving rein to the ego, the part of your mind that's focused on yourself and your desires and your needs. So instead, the teaching and the practice is focus on, drain your mind, focus on the present moment. And it's effectively, I think that the neuroscience hypothesis would be that you are not training yourself to be selfless. You are training a part of your brain that if you can strengthen that part of the brain, it results in you being selfless and it results in you being enlightened. So it's not so much, don't think of it as I'm trying to be enlightened, as I am, in the same way that, lots of activities, there's a part of the training that doesn't seem to have any bearing on the end result, but by doing it, you make your brain better at, some part of the process that's essential, and eventually you can do the end result. And sort of related to that, I guess, is kind of going back to what I was talking about with koans, of trying to sort of turn off the rational part of your mind, the analytical, language-based part of your mind, is that language and rationality in general are very limited things. So one of the ways that this is typically expressed is the idea of the finger pointing at the moon, or if you want, the finger pointing at the sun. So right now, basically, I perceive the sun as a bunch of kind of rays of light, and in my mind it turns it into this. There's this thing out there, and there's me here, and I have this concept of the sun, and I can point at the sun with my finger, and I can say that's the sun, but that's not actually the sun. It's just this language that I'm using to try and express it, and it's hard for me to express what I'm saying because it's hard to express things with language. So the point is that the part of your brain that you're trying to train is specifically the part that doesn't use language. So you can't understand it with language. So that's why you go through all of these hoops. That's why you use these koans. You ask these questions that seem to not make any sense. It's why you focus so much on draining your mind of thoughts and that narrative voice that's constantly running. It's because you're specifically trying to strengthen the part of your brain that can never work in those terms.
One way that language has been described by neuroscientists and cognitive scientists is that it's a way of making a concept concrete so that you can work with it. So language, by necessity, each concept is it's nebulous per se, but it is something to be made workable. It's not floating. So going back to your right brain, left brain distinction, the left brain tends to narrow down and it creates language so that you can make concepts workable. And the right brain has essentially, it's freer. It's not stuck with anything, but you can't work with it because you need the specificity of language to do that part. That's why it's so difficult to go from one to the other.
I found the quote, actually. I realized my description of the finger pointing at the moon thing was terrible, and I realized I should have just read the quote. So this is from, let's see, Hui Neng, which I think is a Chinese, actually, Buddhist. So he says, truth and words are unrelated. Truth can be compared to the moon. answered Tweeting, pointing them to the moon with his finger. And words can be compared to a finger. I can use my finger to point out the moon, but my finger is not the moon, and you don't need my finger in order to be able to see the moon. So the point, this is kind of the idea of Zen is all about practice, and this is part of the reason why, like, Zen, is much less about like a dude talking at you and much more about you just sit and do it. It's the idea that it's impossible for me to explain to you what you're trying to do because what you're trying to do can't be expressed in words. But someone who's never heard any of the words that I'm saying could still find it if they did the right practice. So it's, if you are interested in doing Zen, there's no substitute for practice. You cannot achieve the end results of Zen by reading about it or studying it or taking a class on it or anything. The only way to get there is to force your brain to learn it. Anyway, it's 5 o'clock, so I want to end with, there's this great, that book that I read about the conference has this great sort of blessing or dedication that I guess they say at the end of it every year, and I think it's a traditional Tibetan thing, so I will say it, and then we'll be done. Here we go. Whatever benefit and merit may have arisen here, we dedicate it for the benefit of all beings. Thank you.